I strongly suspect that the injunctions found in the Hebrew Bible, often called the Old Testament by Christians, would have proven a rather marginal aspect of world religious history had it not been for the enormous success of Christianity and Islam. That said, given that success, there can be no denying that the customs, taboos, and legal sensibilities of the rather marginal Israelites have entered into the cultural and religious dimensions of the lives of billions of people. This is especially the case when we consider our cultural appreciation, or rather I should say depreciation, of magic. Much of what happened in the witch trials leaned heavily on the Hebrew Bible to justify the misogynistic persecution of, quote, witches. And the thin margins which separate magic, technology, and religion serve to protect those practicing magic at the margins of medieval and pre-modern science. What can we say about the magical practices of the ancient Israelites? What was forbidden and what was allowed? What various types of magic were there? And what can prohibition tell us about these ancient near-monotheists? In this episode of Esoterica, we're going to explore the world of ancient Israelite magic. I'm Dr. Justin Sledge, and welcome to Esoterica, where we explore the arcane side of history, philosophy, and religion. As you may imagine, ancient Israel, for better or worse, is one of the most studied ancient societies in the world. For better, because every ancient society deserves to be understood. And for worse, because people primarily study this ancient society in the furtherance of their own religious agenda. This has produced a mountain of scholarship, and any position taken on virtually any topic in this field is going to generate controversy. And this is certainly true when we study magic in ancient Israel. That said, hold my beer. For the purposes of this episode, I'm going to limit what I mean by ancient Israelite society. From roughly the period around 1000 BCE, which roughly corresponds to the rule of King David, to around 500 BCE, or roughly the time period of the redaction of the Hebrew Bible as we know it. Further, I'm going to use magic in a bit of a restricted sense. Here I'm going to mean it's something like forbidden supernatural activity. But don't worry, I'll also be making a future episode about permitted ancient Israelite supernatural activity, such as the consultation through the Umim and the Thummim, or the ordeal by water, the infamous Sotah ritual, so stay tuned for that. What is perhaps most interesting about ancient Israelite magical practices is just how little it is attested in either the archaeological data or in the literary record. Unlike in other nearby societies in which magic seems ubiquitous and well attested at various historical registers, ancient Israel remains somewhat mysterious on this issue. What might explain this? One answer is that the ancient Israelites simply didn't practice magic and therefore very little evidence of it survives. This strikes me as extremely unlikely for reasons that I'll mention in a moment. The second possibility is that ancient Israel is just such a small society that very little archaeological remains of these kinds will be found at all. It's a bit of a numbers game. Small societies produce smaller archaeological footprints, and therefore we simply have much less data. This seems more plausible, though some archaeological evidence of magic has presented itself. We'll explore that in a moment. The third possibility is that magic was widespread in ancient Israel, but the information has been somehow suppressed. This may be possible given something like the Inquisition of King Josiah, in which political and theological control were centralized in Jerusalem, and all other shrines or worship were forbidden. We see evidence of one of these shrines being destroyed at Tel Arad, which has luckily survived in the archaeological record. Though such suppression and censorship would require a relatively high level of bureaucratic and centralized control, and one wonders to what degree ancient Israel ever achieved such control and power. At the Register of Material Culture, very little evidence of magic survives from ancient Israel. Perhaps the most important survivals are two very small silver scrolls that were found placed into tombs at Ketef Hinnom, and date just prior to the destruction of Jerusalem in 586 BCE. These scrolls bear a Paleo-Hebrew inscription that is remarkably similar to text found in the Hebrew Bible, especially the priestly benediction found at number 6. Similar kinds of amulets have also been found in the Eastern Mediterranean, such as those used by the Phoenicians. And it is likely that the repetitious use of the language of to guard or to protect in these scrolls represents their use as a kind of amulet to protect the dead, either from grave robbers or from some kind of malevolent supernatural entities. It should also be noted that such supernatural entities seem conspicuously missing in ancient Israelite mythology, despite being widely attested both in ancient Egypt, ancient Canaan, and ancient Mesopotamia. The absence of such supernatural entities may also be an indicator or a clue as to why we actually have so few of these amulets to survive. If you don't have much in the way of demons, then you don't need much in the way of amulets. Just 2 further points on these tiny scroll amulets. The first is, you'll notice I defined magic as prohibited supernatural activity earlier, and it's reasonable to ask whether or not such amulets would have been prohibited. And the answer is, I don't know. The use of such amulets is never strictly forbidden in any ancient Israelite text that I know of, including the Hebrew Bible. However, these scrolls do use the divine name, Yod He Vav He, and if the priestly concerns around cleanliness and uncleanliness that dominate the Hebrew Bible matter, there is certainly nothing more ritually unclean in the ancient Near East, and specifically in Israelite society, than corpse uncleanliness. The use of the divine name, which is often thought to have tremendous sacred power, that one could place the holy divine name in a place precisely marked by extreme ritual uncleanliness, seems at least unorthodox. So I can doubt that the ritual practitioners or the priests of ancient Israel would have given enthusiastic consent of the idea of placing the divine name in a place like a tomb. Though, with so little evidence, I have to admit I'm engaging in some degree of, I hope, at least educated, but nevertheless still conjecture. A second point that strikes me as somewhat interesting about these 2 scrolls is that it may be possible that the earliest sections recovered of the Hebrew Bible may have been recovered on protective amulets, which the writers of the Hebrew Bible may themselves have forbidden. There's something ironic and hilarious to me about the prospect that the earliest recoverable text of the Hebrew Bible may have been written in such a way as to have been forbidden by the very people who wrote the Bible in the first place. I think here of Benjamin's angel of history, just mounting the piling wreckage upon wreckage, without any regard to what should be or what should not have been, much less what was allowed and what was forbidden. Benjamin's angel of history simply doesn't care for progress or ethics, and it shouldn't be surprising that the quote-unquote Bible should be recovered in a form that the Bible itself would have forbidden. And there's something about that that gives me a touch of glee. And it is to the Bible that we must turn now. Though I'd like to issue a disclaimer about just what I mean when I say the quote-unquote Bible. It's important to realize that what we have as the Bible is less a unified text and more of something like an ancient Israelite library that has gone through various, often contradictory processes of curation by various editors at various times with various agendas. So saying something like, the Bible says X, is a bit like saying, well, the library says X. Of course it does. Libraries say all kinds of things, because libraries are full of various kinds of books on various types of subjects written by various kinds of people at various kinds of times with varying kinds of agendas. So it's important when we study the Bible or quote from the Bible that we're giving the best contextualization we can. And I hope I can achieve that as we begin to turn to some of these rather infamous texts from the Hebrew Bible. And of course, this is especially conspicuous when we turn to something as culturally specific as the concept of magic. The simple truth is the ancient Israelites, like every other culture, had a complex and technical vocabulary for describing the things that we would now call magic. And as we'll see, most of those terms and practices have been lost to history. That said, let's take a bit of a survey and see what can be recovered, if anything at all, with any specificity. One of the first accounts in the Hebrew Bible that has something to do with what we would call magic is a supernatural duel between Aaron, the brother of Moses, and the Egyptian sorcerers. In this famous story, the Egyptians were able to turn their staves into snakes, thus revealing that the author of this text believed that the Egyptians had supernatural powers, thus winning the duel and showing the supernatural acumen of the ancient Israelites and the power of their God over the Egyptians. Though under the hood of this story, we see a couple of technical terms at work that are worth discussing. The first word we see here used to describe the ancient Egyptian sorcerers is machshim, and this is from the root that generally means something like magic or sorcery or witchcraft. This word appears both in ancient Hebrew and in its cognate form in ancient Akkadian, or rather I should say, it appears in Akkadian and in its cognate form in ancient Hebrew. Here one can compare the Akkadian kishbu with the Hebrew keshef. They both bear the exact same shoresh, or root. This is the word the Hebrew Bible uses most typically to describe magic, and it almost always has a negative or prohibitive sense. Though, it should be pointed out here that the specific sorcerers that are able to turn their staves into snakes are actually referred to as Khartoumei Mitzrayim, which may be something of a metonymy, with this title meaning something like Khartoumi Egyptians, which actually may reveal their ethnic or geographic origin in the distant Sudan. though to be sure, just why they were referred to in this case as Khartoumei Mitzrayim is a bit mysterious. As I've pointed out in other episodes of Esoterica, when the text forbids something, we often learn about what was actually practiced. That is to say, when a culture forbids something, we can probably assume that at least some significant sector of the population or culture was engaging in just that activity. You just don't ban things that people aren't doing. Also, it's worth noting that most of the bans we see in the Hebrew Bible aren't on practices, they're on being certain kinds of people. So the text rarely says, don't practice divination, it will often say, don't be such and such kind of diviner. What the Hebrew Bible seems most interested in is the identity of the Israelites as such, and importantly keeping their identity separate from their neighbors, such as the Philistines. So the Israelite focus is much more on identity than it is on practice, though we will see exceptions to that rule. Perhaps the most infamous interdiction on magic is to be found at Exodus 22, where we read, Machashefa lo techaye, infamously translated in the King James Version of the Bible as, do not suffer a witch to live. The word here, machashefa, is from the same root we mentioned earlier, keshef, meaning magic, here meaning literally the feminine magic doer. Of course, this is highly gendered language and specifically targets women. Such gender targeting occurs both in Israelite but also in its neighboring legal codes. Of course, this verse both expresses the misogyny of the ancient Israelites, but would also go on to reinforce the misogynies of later periods, most horrifyingly in the mass murder of so-called witches in the early modern period. So here we see, in terrifying detail, the consequences of an Israelite interdiction onto the lives and bodies of women through the ages. Later on, in Leviticus chapter 20, verse 27, we are told that one is not allowed to be an ov or a yidoni, and that such a condition requires, again, capital punishment. I'll say more about what the ov was in a moment, but what might the yidoni have been? The answer isn't very clear, and even comparative linguistics doesn't really help us. The rabbis of the Talmud, writing centuries after the Hebrew Bible was completed, seem to associate this practice with placing the bone of a creature called the yadua in the mouth, such that this bone allows the user a kind of necromantic power. Now exactly what this creature, the yadua, is supposed to be, the rabbis can't agree, surprise, surprise, from everything from a toad to a bird to a just generic wild beast being suggested through the ages. It's important to note here that even Jewish experts writing in the first centuries of the Common Era themselves have no clear idea what this practice was. It appears that even by the turn of the Common Era, whatever this practice was has long been lost. A bit later on, at Leviticus 19, we are also told that it is forbidden to nachshu or to onenu. And translations render these words haphazardly as diviner or soothsayer, showing clearly that they don't know what these words mean. As far as we can tell, these seem to be some kinds of illicit forms of divination. Perhaps the first being divination by snakes, or opiomancy. We can see the word nachash here in the verb, and perhaps ariomancy in the second. Here we see the word cloud, anan, in the second verb. But exactly what they were, or how they were practiced, is completely lost. Despite this, you can see how translations are sometimes unreliable. We can clearly see the words snake and cloud in both of these verbs, so we at least have some clue into what they were, though translators simply render them as divination or soothsaying, which, strictly speaking, doesn't seem to be the best translation. Of course, while these forms of divination seem to be forbidden by the Hebrew Bible, the text itself does not ban all forms of divination. Perhaps the most famous forms of divination are the Urim and the Thummim, but various other forms of prophecy abound in the Hebrew Bible, and there is a rich technical vocabulary for the various forms of prophecy to be found in the Hebrew Bible. As I mentioned, I'll be covering these religious magical practices in a future episode. Further on in Leviticus, and I bet you're beginning to notice a trend here, we're seeing many of these prohibitions found in Leviticus, priestly literature, which is deeply concerned with what is ritually clean and what is ritually unclean. And concepts such as cleanliness and uncleanliness are going to be core to how the Israelites separate themselves off from their neighbors. So it isn't surprising that we find so many prohibitions on magic to be found here in the book of Leviticus. At any rate, we are told about some profanation or blasphemy against the divine name of God, although we're not told exactly what happened. The word here for blasphemy is a pretty generic word meaning to curse. We find it in other ancient Near East languages as well. This case is then turned over to Moses, who has to adjudicate the law. At this point, Moses actually pronounces a law, but the word for to curse or to blaspheme slightly changes. We are told then that if someone no-caves, to sort of mix English and Hebrew together, the name of God, they are to be put to death. This word no-cave typically means something like to perforate or to tear. but it clearly has some technical meaning in relationship to the divine name that's been lost. This may represent a transition from the oral culture to the written culture of the Hebrew Bible, where the divine name will be written down on parchment or papyrus, thus indicating that those parchments or papyrus in which the divine name is written down must be treated with some kind of special care. Such an idea is certainly to be found in later Jewish tradition, where texts bearing the divine name, for instance, cannot be burned, but must be buried with ritual honor. This verse also seems to inaugurate the idea that the divine name, Yod He Vav He, seems itself to have some kind of supernatural power, and is therefore subject to proper ritual treatment. This concept, and the contention over how the divine name should be used, is a core part of the debate around the use of the divine name in magical practices in the ancient, medieval, and early modern world. Of course, this immediately raises the question, what just is the proper use of the divine name? When does one nokave the name? And depending on how one interprets this verb nokave, which again is being used in some technical although lost sense, clearly has a bearing on how magic or anti-magical practices are going to go forward. This ambiguity in the ability to translate these technical magical terms is going to have huge ramifications for the practice of magic as we go forward, and I'll talk more about that in just a moment. The most extensive list of forbidden magical practices emerges at Deuteronomy 18. This shouldn't be terribly surprising, given the findings of many text-critical biblical scholars, who regard this section of Deuteronomy to be the most recent recension of Israelite legal codes, and therefore in some sense rolling all previous legal codes into one comprehensive bundle. Here we're told that there cannot be found among the Israelites anyone who passes their son or daughter through the fire. This is probably a reference to a Canaanite religious tradition typically associated with the god Moloch, in which children were passed through the fire either in some kind of baptism treatment or as a human sacrifice, though it is unlikely by the time this text was compiled that that practice was even still going on. And then we have a list of forbidden magical activities. Notice here that the writer is linking these magical practices to non-Israelite Canaanite religious practices. What seems to be important here aren't the practices themselves, but to maintain a distinction between Israelites and non-Israelites. And here we have a substantial list containing some things we've already seen. We are told it is forbidden to be a kosem of kesamim, a me'onen, a menachesh, and a mechashefa, and a mechashef, and a chover of chever, and it also forbids those who ask of an ov or a yedaoni, or those who seek out the dead. As you can see, this is a bit of a grab bag of forbidden magical practices, though the meaning of many of these terms is a bit obscure. Kosem seem to have been some kind of magical or divinatory practices. We're just not sure what they are at all. Although this word has gone on in modern Hebrew to become the word kesem, a word typically reserved for things like stage magic. The term ma'onen probably again comes from the Hebrew word anan, from cloud, and probably again refers to aromancy, a practice we've already seen forbidden back in Leviticus. Here we're given the noun form rather than the verbal form. Again, also we have menachesh from nachash, snake, which again we see here in the noun form as opposed to the verbal form that we found back in Leviticus. The chover of chever is a bit mysterious. It may be something like a pun. It may mean something like binder of friends. The root of the word chover means to tie or to bind. This word may be referring to something like erotic binding magic, better known as love magic, although it's not clear at all what this is from the text. What's interesting about this running phrase of various forms of forbidden magic is that if you consult a translation, whether it be in English or the Greek Septuagint or the Latin Vulgate or the Aramaic Targum, you'll notice that they give a wide range of interpretations about what these practices are, which reveals that the translators don't know what they are, because if they could be translated, they would simply be translated. But the fact that they must interpret them means that even the translators aren't quite sure what they mean. This is especially revealing in the Septuagint, one of the earliest translations ever made of the Hebrew Bible into Greek, and the Targumim, the translations of the Hebrew Bible into Aramaic. Even in these early translations, they're doing more interpretation than they are translation, which shows that even very early on, exactly what these practices were has been lost. Before turning to the more necromantic practices that seem to occur at the end of this list, I want to point out what seems conspicuously missing from the Israelite context. Unlike the neighbors of ancient Israel, we don't see the elaborate exorcism rituals, nor the liver divination practices ubiquitous in Mesopotamian magic. Further, there's no sense from these texts that magic is simply woven into the fabric of reality, like it is in the Egyptian conception of Heka. Ancient Israel seems, when compared to other nearby societies, conspicuously bare of what we would now call magic. That's not to say it wasn't practiced. I think the prohibitions here found in the Hebrew Bible are indicators that it was. But it seems like it may have been simply less ubiquitous. Perhaps it was either less popular at the level of the literary elite, or simply suppressed in the literature at some period. We just don't know. Finally, let's turn to an analysis of the more necromantic magic mentioned in earlier texts. Though notice in the list here found at Deuteronomy that the Ov and the Yid'oni are separated from the practice of, quote, seeking out the dead. The word seeking out there is from the same root that we see later in the words like midrash or darash, which means to study. Why seeking out the dead is given specific mention over and against the Ov and the Yid'oni are not clear. So we've left the concept of seeking out the Ov or consulting an Ov last because it's actually the one we have the best insight to. This is because a story told at 1 Samuel 28, in which the despondent Saul visits the famous witch at Endor. It's important to note what sets up this story. Saul has been engaged in a war with the Philistines, and the war is going very badly. In an attempt to figure out how the war will go, Saul does attempt to consult the legitimate forms of divination, the Urim and the Thummim, only to find, to his terror, that they've gone silent. God has abandoned Saul. And just as a side note, I have to say, I always loved this story as a kid because I always imagined King Saul, the witch at Endor, and a bunch of Ewoks getting together to fight the Philistines for some reason. Why George Lucas named the planet Endor is beyond me, but I'm about it. But Star Wars references aside, Saul visits a woman that if we translate literally from the Hebrew is something like the woman who was the master of the Ov at Endor. Endor is 2 words in Hebrew, not Endor, 1 word in Star Wars language. And he does this in order to conjure up the recently deceased prophet Samuel to learn about what his fate will be in this war with the Philistines. At first, the Baalat Ov, which I'm going to refer to her in Hebrew rather than English because I don't like this phrase, witch of Endor. The word witch has so many connotations in English that I think it covers over what's going on in this ancient Israelite story. So at any rate, the Baalat Ov, or the mistress of the Ov, refuses actually to summon Samuel at first, citing the fact that Saul himself has made this practice forbidden among the Israelites. Saul then proceeds to give her immunity from the law, and she proceeds with the evocation. Now we're not given any clear description of how the evocation actually happens. Here the Baalat Ov is successful in bringing up. Again, we have the idea that the spirit or the ruach of Samuel is in the earth and is being pulled up from Sheol into this world. And this entire event must have been genuinely terrifying to all those involved. The Baalat Ov, herself a ritual expert, shrieks in terror at what she sees. And what she sees is genuinely strange. As the ghost of Samuel rises from the earth, she doesn't immediately describe it as the ghost of Samuel. Rather, she says she sees Elohim rising from the earth. As I'm sure many of you know, the word Elohim means God or gods. So it's interesting that whatever the spirit of Samuel was rising from the earth strikes this ritual practitioner as something like a god. The dead prophet Samuel appears, and the prophecy for Saul is of course grim. God has abandoned King Saul. He will lose the war with the Philistines the next day. And worse, he will die at his own hands on the battlefield. There's simply no hope. Unsurprisingly, Saul, learning this, becomes despondent and refuses to even eat. This next section of the story, I think, gets very little attention, but I think it's incredibly important, actually. Seeing the despondency of Saul, the Baalat Ov actually slaughters one of her calves in order to feed him and his men. This woman, who we only can assume comes from meager means, actually slaughters a prize animal in order to coax Saul from his depression. I find it interesting that the text could have painted the Baalat Ov in all kinds of evil and sinister ways. But we're left with the impression of a woman who wants to follow the Israelite law. Notice that she first refuses to engage in the necromancy given the fact that it is illegal by Israelite law. And secondly, she's willing to open up her home and food to what are effectively strangers. The image we get here is not the typical European idea of the witch, malevolent and hideous, living in the forest and eating children, the stuff of Grimm's fairy tales. Rather, we're given the image of a woman who is attempting to follow the law, despite the fact that she does have some forbidden knowledge. And further, we see here a kindly host, willing to open their home and their animals to feed those who come. A woman comforting someone facing the brutal reality of war and fate. As you can see, we can ascertain some aspects of ancient Israelite magic, if only through a glass darkly. From divination to necromancy, it does seem like some forms of magic existed in ancient Israel, even if the exact natures of those practices have been lost to history. Though, from the prohibitions, we are given some glimpse into what may have actually been practiced, though those technical terms, again, remain mysterious. And it is exactly the obscurity of those technical terms that is going to matter greatly into the future of the practice of magic. Because these terms aren't terribly specific, and because we don't know quite what they mean, there's going to be a bit of play into what is allowed and what is forbidden. Of course, if one wants to have a very strict reading of these texts, it is easy to point out that various times and various locations, various forms of magic are forbidden. And by extension, if various forms of magic are forbidden, it is possible to understand that all forms of magic are forbidden. Indeed, anything smelling of magic would be forbidden. The infamous line, "Suffer not a witch to live," comes to mind. Here, if one has a very strict interpretation of what magic is, can simply say no magic is allowed under the rubric of this verse. And that's precisely how the logic of the witch hunters worked in the early modern period. Though it's also possible to use this obscurity as a kind of shield. For instance, a historically important example are amulet makers. If one is an amulet maker and one is accused of engaging in illicit magic, one could easily make the counterclaim. Where in the Hebrew Bible does it say one is not allowed to make amulets? And further, if one is really learned, one can even claim you don't even know what any of these words mean anyhow. So if it doesn't say that amulets are forbidden, then they must be allowed. And further, if you don't know what any of these words mean, then how can you forbid anything? The obscurity of these technical terms allows for a kind of liminal space in which magic may get a foothold and not only live, but thrive. And we see exactly that happen in the post-biblical Jewish world. There is a positive profusion of Jewish magic. An example of something like this actually happens in the Talmud. In Tractate Sanhedrin, there is a long discussion about just what sorcery is, that is to say, what is allowed and what is forbidden and what is subject to the death penalty. And curiously, of all the things that are allowed, one of them is the most shocking. One is actually allowed to create artificial animals and people using some process called Hilchot Yetzirah. Of course, many of you will recognize the origins of the golem story here. So there's something hilarious about the idea that it's forbidden to look to the clouds to figure out what's going to happen in the future, but one is allowed godlike powers over the creation of what seems to be artificial life itself. The obscurity of these terms and the vagueness of what is allowed and permitted opens up a space of magical theory and practice that will eventually underwrite Solomonic magic and a great deal of the magical practices of the European tradition. By analyzing what is forbidden, we have gotten some glimpse into what kind of magic was practiced in ancient Israel. Here we have some forms of divination, perhaps by clouds and snakes, and what appears to be some forms of necromancy. It also appears from the archaeological record that some form of apopotreic magic was also employed in the form of silver amulets to protect the dead, though just to what degree this practice would have been forbidden isn't clear. If you're interested in the history of magic and mysticism, of alchemy and Kabbalah, make sure to subscribe. These are all mainstay topics here at Esoterica, and I hope you'll consider supporting our project on Patreon or with a one-time donation. The Trachtenberg text, Jewish Magic and Superstition, while once a classic, is now very dated, unfortunately. I can recommend it still. There's still a lot of great information in here, but you have to proceed very carefully and take some things he says with a grain of salt. More recent scholarship has updated what we now know about ancient Jewish magic, and just generally the term superstition is not really used anymore. The best contemporary scholarly studies on Jewish magic are Gideon Bohak's Ancient Jewish Magic and Yuval Harari's Magic Before the Rise of the Kabbalah. Both of these texts are excellent overviews of the field, and honestly I couldn't pick between them. They're both amazing scholarship, well-written, well-researched, with copious notes and bibliographies. Anyone interested in the history of magic, Jewish or otherwise, should have them or at least consult them. Until next time, I'm Dr. Justin Sledge, and you've been watching Esoterica, where we explore the arcane side of history, philosophy, and religion.